Chapter 52 of the Adventures of Ferdinand, Count Fathom, by Tobias Smollett. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. Before this affair could be brought to a proper explanation, the season being almost ended, the ladies departed from Tunbridge, and, in a little time, Dr. Fathom followed them to London, having previously obtained permission to visit them in that metropolis. He had solicited the same favour of some other families, in which he hoped to take root, though he knew they were pre-engaged to different physicians; and resolving to make his first medical appearance in London with some eclat, he not only purchased an old chariot, which was new painted for the purpose, but likewise hired a footman, whom he clothed in laced livery, in order to distinguish himself from the common run of his brethren. This equipage, though much more expensive than his finances could bear, he found absolutely necessary to give him a chance for employment, as every shabby retainer to physic in this capital had provided himself with a vehicle, which was altogether used by way of a travelling signpost to draw in customers, so that a walking physician was considered as an obscure pedlar trudging from street to street, with his pack of knowledge on his shoulders, and selling his remnants of advice by retail. A chariot was not now set up for the convenience of a man sinking under the fatigue of extensive practice, but as a piece of furniture, every way as necessary as a large periwig with 3 tails. And a physician, let his merit in other respects be never so conspicuous, can no more expect to become considerable in business, without the assistance of this implement, than he can hope to live without food, or breathe without a windpipe. This requisite is so well understood, that, exclusive of those who profess themselves doctors, every raw surgeon, every idle apothecary, who can make interest with some foolhardy coachmaker, may be seen dancing the bays in all places of public resort, and grinning to one another from their respective carriages. Hence proceed many of those cruel accidents which are recorded in the daily papers. An apothecary's horses take fright, and run away with his chariot, which is heard of no more. An eminent surgeon, being overturned, is so terrified at the thoughts of mutilation, that he resolves to walk on foot all the days of his life. And the coachman of a physician of great practice, having the misfortune to be disabled by a fall from the box, his master can never find another to supply his place. None of these observations escaped the penetrating eye of Fathom, who, before he pretended to seat himself in this machine, had made proper inquiry into all the other methods practised, with a view to keep the wheels in motion. In his researches, he found that the great world was wholly engrossed by a few practitioners, who had arrived at the summit of reputation, consequently were no longer obliged to cultivate those arts by which they rose, and that the rest of the business was parcelled out into small enclosures, occupied by different groups of personages, male and female, who stood in rings, and tossed the ball from one to another, there being in each department 2 sets, the individuals of which relieved one another occasionally. Every knot was composed of a waiting woman, nurse, apothecary, surgeon, and physician, and sometimes a midwife was admitted into the party. And in this manner the farce was commonly performed. A fine lady, fatigued with idleness, complains of the vapours, is deprived of her rest, though not so sick as to have recourse to medicine. Her favourite maid, tired with giving her attendance in the night, thinks proper, for the benefit of her own repose, to complain of a violent headache, and recommends to her mistress a nurse of approved tenderness and discretion, at whose house in all likelihood the said chambermaid hath oft given the rendezvous to a male friend. The nurse, well skilled in the mysteries of her occupation, persuades the patient that her malady, far from being slight or chimerical, may proceed to a very dangerous degree of the hysterical affection, unless it be nipped in the bud by some very effectual remedy. Then she recounts a surprising cure performed by a certain apothecary, and appeals to the testimony of the waiting woman, who, being the gossip of his wife, confirms the evidence, and corroborates the proposal. The apothecary, being summoned, finds her ladyship in such a delicate situation, that he declines prescribing, and advises her to send for a physician without delay. The nomination of course falls to him, and the doctor, being called, declares the necessity of immediate venesection, which is accordingly performed by a surgeon of the association. This is one way of beginning the game, though the commencement often varies, and sometimes the apothecary and sometimes the physician opens the scene. But be that as it will, they always appear in a string, like a flight of wild geese. Each confederacy maintains a correspondence with one particular undertaker. Fathom, upon these considerations, set up his rest in the first floor of an apothecary in the neighbourhood of Charing Cross, to whom he was introduced by a letter from a friend at Tunbridge, and who, being made acquainted with his ability and scheme, promised to let slip no opportunity of serving him, and indeed seemed to espouse his interest with great alacrity. He introduced him to some of his patients, on the strength of a gratis visit, sounded forth his praise among all the good women of his acquaintance, and even prevailed upon him to publish advertisements, importing that he would every day, at a certain time and place, give his advice to the poor for nothing, hoping that, by means of some lucky cure, his fame might be extended, and his practice grow into request. In the meantime, his chariot rolled along through the most frequented streets, during the whole forenoon, and, at the usual hour, he never failed to make his appearance at the medical coffee house, with all that solemnity of feature and address by which the modern sons of Paean are distinguished. Not but that he was often puzzled about the decision of his diurnal route. For the method of driving up one street and down another, without halting, was become such a stale expedient, that the very prentices used to stand at the shop doors and ridicule the vain parade. At length, however, he perused the map of London with great diligence, and, having acquired a distinct idea of its topography, used to light at the end of long narrow thoroughfares, and paved courts, where the chariot was ordered to wait till his return, and, walking with great gravity through the different turnings of these alleys, regain his carriage by another passage, and resume his seat with an air of vast importance. With a view to protract the time of his supposed visits, he would, at one place, turn aside to a wall; at another, cheapen a urinal; at a third, read a quack advertisement, or lounge a few minutes in some bookseller's shop; and lastly, glide into some obscure coffee house, and treat himself with a dram of usquebaugh. The other means used to force a trade, such as ordering himself to be called from church, alarming the neighbourhood with knocking at his door in the night, receiving sudden messages in places of resort, and inserting his cures by way of news in the daily papers, had been so injudiciously hackneyed by every desperate scholar in physic, that they had lost their effect upon the public, and therefore were excluded from the plan of our adventurer, whose scheme, for the present, was to exert himself by winning the favour of those sage sibyls who keep, as it were, the temple of medicine, and admit the young priest to the service of the altar. But this he considered as a temporary project, only until he should have acquired interest enough to erect a hospital lock, or infirmary, by the voluntary subscription of his friends; a scheme which had succeeded to a miracle with many of the profession, who had raised themselves into notice upon the carcasses of the poor. Yet even this branch was already overstocked, insomuch that almost every street was furnished with one of these charitable receptacles, which, instead of diminishing the taxes for the maintenance of the poor, encouraged the vulgar to be idle and dissolute, by opening an asylum to them and their families from the diseases of poverty and intemperance. For it remains to be proved that the parish rates are decreased, the bills of mortality lessened, the people more numerous, or the streets less infested with beggars, notwithstanding the immense sums yearly granted by individuals for the relief of the indigent. But, waiving these reflections, Dr. Fathom hoped that his landlord would be a most useful implement for extending his influence, and for that reason admitted him into a degree of partnership, after being fully convinced that he was not under articles to any other physician. Nevertheless, he was very much mistaken in reckoning on the importance of his new ally, who was, like himself, a needy adventurer, settled upon credit, and altogether unemployed, except among the very refuse of the people, whom no other person would take the trouble to attend. So that our hero got little else than experience and trouble, except a few guineas which he made shift to glean among sojourners, with whom he became occasionally acquainted, or young people who had been unfortunate in their amours. In the midst of these endeavours, he did not omit his duty to the old gentlewoman, whose daughter he had cured at Tunbridge, and was always received with particular complacency, which, perhaps, he, in some measure, owed to his genteel equipage, that gave credit to every door before which it was seen. Yet Miss Biddy was as inaccessible as ever, while the mother became more and more warm in her civilities, till at length, After having prepared him with some extraordinary compliments, she gave him to understand that Biddy was no better than a giddy-headed girl, far from being unexceptionable in her moral character, and particularly deficient in duty and gratitude to her, who had been always a tender and indulgent parent. She was therefore determined to punish the young minx for her levity and want of natural affection, by altering her own condition, could she find a worthy and agreeable man, on whom she could bestow her hand and fortune without a blush. The film was instantly removed from Fathom's eyes by this declaration, which she uttered with such a significancy of look as thrilled to his soul with joyful presage, while he replied, it would indeed be a difficult task to find a man who merited such happiness and honour; but surely some there were, who would task their faculties to the uttermost in manifesting their gratitude and desire of rendering themselves worthy of such distinction. Though this answer was pronounced in such a manner as gave her to understand he had taken the hint, she would not cheapen her condescension so much as to explain herself further at that juncture, and he was very well contented to woo her on her own terms. Accordingly, he began to season his behaviour with a spice of gallantry, when he had opportunities of being particular with this new inamorata; and, in proportion to the returns she made, he gradually detached himself from Miss Biddy, by intermitting, and at last discontinuing those ardent expressions of love and admiration, which he had made shift to convey in private looks and stolen whispers during the rancorous inspection of her mother. Such alteration could not long escape the jealous eyes of the young lady, no more than the cause of this alienation, which in a moment converted all her love into irreconcilable hate, and filled her whole soul with the most eager desire of vengeance. For she now not only considered him as a mercenary wretch, who had slighted her attractions for the sordid gratifications of avarice, but also as an interloper, who wanted to intercept her fortune, in the odious character of a father-in-law. But before she could bring her aim into any ripeness of contrivance, her mother, having caught cold at church, was seized with a rheumatic fever, became delirious in less than 3 days, and, notwithstanding all the prescriptions and care of her admirer, gave up the ghost, without having retrieved the use of her senses, or been able to manifest by will the sentiments she entertained in favour of her physician, who, as the reader will easily perceive, had more reasons than one to be mortally chagrined at this event. Miss Biddy, thus being put in possession of the whole inheritance, not only renounced all correspondence with Dr. Fathom, by forbidding him the house, but likewise took all opportunities of prejudicing his character, by hinting that her dear mamma had fallen a sacrifice to his ignorance and presumption. Chapter 52.